And just as was true then, so too now, we do not seem to be any more committed to equity and true democracy than was the case in the mid-1990s. The vast majority of those called white seem to continue to insist, as we have for decades, literally for generations, that people of color have fully equal opportunity in America in employment, education, housing, and even treatment within the criminal justice system, so that if they find themselves behind, it must be their fault. And in fact, according to a survey taken by folks at Harvard just a couple of years ago, apparently, not only do we think that people of color have equal opportunity, we seem to think they have more of it than we do. This study done by folks at Harvard found that we white folks are convinced that we're the ones who are the victims of invidious discrimination, that we are the ones who, we can't find jobs, is what they say, because all the jobs are going to black and brown folks. Really, 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 where are these jobs that black and brown people are taking from white folks? Are they in Second Life? Where in the hell are these jobs? Are they on Minecraft? Where exactly are these jobs? Because in the real world, the world that the Labor Department surveys every month, and therefore the actual one, as opposed to the one that we make up in our fevered imaginations, people of color are twice as likely as white folks to be unemployed. So if in fact black and brown folks are taking the jobs, they ain't taking them far. They're taking them like a block and then dropping them like a hot potato, because they are still twice as likely as we are to be out of work. And that is true even when they have the same education and experience as we do. So for instance, according to the Labor Department, African American folks with a college degree who did everything right, stayed in school, did what we said to do, had the right value system, the right work ethic, all the stuff that we like to lecture about, right? That black folks with a college degree still twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be unemployed, even when their major is the same as white folks. Latino folk with a degree, about 55% more likely than white folks with a degree.
Hello guys, welcome once again to our free post. I hope wherever you are, you're having a great time. We have always talked about the biases that black Americans have faced in the United States, and you've heard many times when many Americans say that their jobs have been taken. They say that immigrants coming to the United States have taken up their jobs. Sometimes when we have things like the DEI, they say that these ones are used to favor blacks to take up our jobs. So for white America, it seems like their jobs are always being taken away from them. Is this the truth? Because if you look at the statistics in America, you will be told that blacks are twice as likely to be unemployed compared to their white counterparts. And therefore, who tells you that they are taking up the jobs of whites? Could it be that whites are just jealous and they don't want blacks to have better economic outcome for themselves? I want you to listen to this clip by one great speaker, Dr. Tim Wise. He was speaking at an event where he analyzed the issues of meritocracy and the lie of meritocracy in America, and why white America feels so entitled about their Americanness and that they don't want any other ethnic group to take up their position. I want you to take a listen to this clip, then I'll be back in the end.
And just as was true then, so too now, we do not seem to be any more committed to equity and true democracy than was the case in the mid-1990s. The vast majority of those called white seem to continue to insist, as we have for decades, literally for generations, that people of color have fully equal opportunity in America in employment, education, housing, and even treatment within the criminal justice system, so that if they find themselves behind, it must be their fault. And in fact, according to a survey taken by folks at Harvard just a couple of years ago, apparently, not only do we think that people of color have equal opportunity, we seem to think they have more of it than we do. This study done by folks at Harvard found that we white folks are convinced that we're the ones who are the victims of invidious discrimination, that we are the ones who, we can't find jobs, is what they say, because all the jobs are going to black and brown folks. Really, 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 where are these jobs that black and brown people are taking from white folks? Are they in Second Life? Where in the hell are these jobs? Are they on Minecraft? Where exactly are these jobs? Because in the real world, the world that the Labor Department surveys every month, and therefore the actual one, as opposed to the one that we make up in our fevered imaginations, people of color are twice as likely as white folks to be unemployed. So if in fact black and brown folks are taking the jobs, they ain't taking them far. They're taking them like a block and then dropping them like a hot potato, because they are still twice as likely as we are to be out of work. And that is true even when they have the same education and experience as we do. So for instance, according to the Labor Department, African American folks with a college degree who did everything right, stayed in school, did what we said to do, had the right value system, the right work ethic, all the stuff that we like to lecture about, right? That black folks with a college degree still twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be unemployed, even when their major is the same as white folks. Latino folk with a degree, about 55% more likely than white folks with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans with a degree, about 25% to 30% more likely than white folks with a degree to be unemployed. This is especially true for younger, newer graduates. Those of our indigenous brothers and sisters, Native North American folk with a degree, about 2/3 more likely than white folks with a degree to be unemployed, which is to say that those who believe that people of color have even equal treatment would be wrong. To think that they have better treatment and that it is we who are white who face discrimination is to invert reality altogether. And yet the survey data suggests that we sincerely believe that. But again, there is simply no evidence, not only in the labor market, but anywhere else. There are those who say, well, if I was just black, I would have gotten into Harvard. Yeah, okay. Here's the thing. If you'd have been black, you'd have been black for all 18 years before you even applied to Harvard, precious. Which means that you would have been twice as likely to be in a family with unemployed parents, 3 times as likely to be poor, 1/20th the net worth. You'd have had twice the likelihood of dying in infancy before you even went to preschool, let alone college. That is to say, that to believe that somehow we who were white would be better off were we people of color is only something you could believe if you ignored every single day for the 18 years before you actually applied for college and then supposedly got this bump, supposedly got this advantage, an advantage which I should point out has brought us to a place today where even today only 12% of college students at the nation's most elite schools are black or Latino combined. The idea that people of color are taking all the quote-unquote top college slots from white folks, once again, completely untrue. In fact, white students are more likely than any other group of students to get into their first choice college, and that has been true consistently year in and year out, this year, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. If you didn't get into Harvard, it's because some richer white kid whose daddy has better connections got their kid into Harvard. Trust me when I tell you that the anger is misplaced. And yet we're being encouraged to believe that when we lose out on stuff, it's because of those brown folk. That's what Donald Trump's whole political message is. A rich white man trying to tell working class white people that their enemy is other working class people who just so happen to have darker colored skin than themselves. Fascinating. A rich white dude saying, pay no attention to Oz behind the curtain. It ain't me. It ain't nobody like me. It's not the companies run by rich white folks who sent the jobs to Mexico or sent the jobs to Sri Lanka or sent the jobs to Guatemala or sent the jobs to Bangladesh. It's those damn Bangladeshi workers who took the jobs. That is not how the global economy works. No, it's not. But we get mad at those at the bottom, not those at the top, and we act as if those at the top are right when they tell us to hate one another, instead of thinking about the larger system, right? The reason folks aren't finding jobs is not because of affirmative action, it's not because of immigration, it's because we have an economy where there are 2 people out of work for every job opening in this country, and that's almost always how it is. During the recession, it was actually 8-to-1. 8 people out of work for every job, but you want to blame unemployed people for being on unemployment insurance? You want to blame poor folks for relying on public assistance when there's only 1 job for every 8 people who need one? In certain urban communities and rural communities that are white on the back end and black and brown on the front end, right? There might be as many as 10 people out of work, even 14 people out of work in certain communities for every job that pays above the poverty line. That's the problem. It's not brown folk poaching jobs. black folk poaching jobs, poor people taking advantage. It's about an economy that doesn't believe in providing opportunity, and it's about an economy that allows wealthy white dudes on Wall Street to jack $12.5 trillion of other people's money and escape without a jail sentence. That is what the problem is, because if you steal $100 worth of food stamps in this country, I promise you will do 10 years. $100 worth of food stamp fraud, and you will be taken from your family and locked up. And these guys stole $12.5 trillion with a T. That is 20% of the net worth of the United States of America, which it took over 230 years to build up, and they wiped it clean in 18 months. And people get mad when I say that they were rich white dudes. They don't like me to mention that. They say things like, why do you have to mention that the guys on Wall Street were white? That's sort of racist. No, it's not. It's descriptive. And here's the thing, if they'd have been black, all y'all would have noticed, right? Everybody would have noticed. If black people walk off with $12.5 trillion of other people's money, oh, that shit will be pointed out. Somebody will make a point of noting that black people are obviously criminals and obviously dishonest, and that we know because of all the loot that they took on Wall Street. But when a bunch of rich white dudes with high SAT scores and MBAs do the same thing, nobody wants to talk about it like a group phenomenon. Isn't that interesting? See, people of color do something wrong and it sticks to the group. Right? Whether it's street crime, whether it's terrorism done by brown folk, but only by brown folk. White folks do it, it doesn't stick to us. Looting and theft done by black and brown folk on the street, it's a group phenomenon done by white folks in office suites and banks, it's not. Right? You have any idea how many years it would take for all the black and brown street criminals in the history of either streets or criminals to steal $12.5 trillion? Any idea? $12.5 trillion? It would take like 5,000 years, right? And you would have to steal around the clock, man, 24/7, just hand in the pocket, stealing your stuff, never taking a break to pee, sleep, eat, do anything but steal. And like 5,000 years in, you'd be like, hey, y'all got 12.5 trillion yet? And the thief would be like, nope, not even close. But 18 months these rich white dudes did it, and not one of them is in the middle of a jail cell right now as I speak. That's the problem. That's the problem. Not black folk, not brown folk, not poor folk, not indigenous folk, not immigrants, be they documented or not, but people with a lot of dough, a lot of loot, more than all of us put together, who don't believe in creating an economy that works for us all, but they pit us against each other and they do it very well. That has not changed in 20 years. In addition, it's really more than just 20 years, it's more than that. The fact is, this white denial, and I feel compelled to say this because it's easily misunderstood. When I talk about white denial, there are always white folks who get very uptight. Well, I'm not in denial. I wasn't talking about you then, okay? If I'm not talking about you, why are you tripping? Why are you getting so upset? If I'm not talking about you, then just chill. Like if I said that you were a serial killer and you know where you were last Wednesday, then we're good, right? We're good. You don't have to get all freaked out. You don't have to bother yourself. You don't have to, tweet stuff. You just like chill and we'll be done in like a half an hour, right? So I'm not saying that everybody's in denial, but I'm saying that as a general rule, right, white folks as a corporate entity, and I know we don't like to think of ourselves as such, but there really is this larger social phenomenon known as white America. And there have always been people who dissented from it, very important, right? There were always white folks who dissented from the corporate entity known as white America. There were white folks who stood up against indigenous Native North American genocide and the expulsion of Native peoples from their land. They were the distinct minority, but it's worth noting that they existed. That doesn't mean that white America in general wasn't down with Indian removal, though, because they were. There were white folks who were mightily opposed to the enslavement of African peoples, and we want to point that out and make clear that there were white folks who dissented from that system. But now that doesn't change the fact, does it, that white America in a general sense didn't do much to fight for a very long time the system of enslavement. Plenty of white folks didn't own businesses in Jim Crow segregation, but very few white folks stood up against those who did. That's the point, right? We can make some general assertions about whiteness as a social thing, even though we're not judging white people as individuals. It's not about white people. Sometimes people get tripped up on that and he hates white people. Let me be clear. I love me some white people. love white people. I mean, really, like, my wife is white, love her. Love her. Our daughters, 14 and 12, love them. White girls. Right? Which is what happens when white people make babies. You get these white children, and then I love them, and then my mom, oh my God, nice white lady, love her. My dad and I don't get along, but that's not because he's white. That's about some other shit. So I don't even have time to talk about that tonight. That's therapy stuff, so you write to me later, we'll work that out. But anyway, it's not about white people, it's about whiteness as a social function, as a force, right? As an institutional norm. That's what I'm talking about. And if you look at that over time, you find that this white denial has been an ever-present thing. Like, not just now and not just 20 years ago. Go back even to the early 60s, man. We're talking like before the Civil Rights Act was even passed, right? Civil Rights Act gets passed in '64 that makes discrimination in public accommodations and employment and those kinds of things illegal. So before that, you could get away with a lot of discrimination. It wasn't even against the law, really. 1965 is the Voting Rights Act. 1968 is the Fair Housing Act. So you can go back before that. 1963, right? That's the year of the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech. It's the year of the Birmingham campaign, where the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed by Klansmen, and where Sheriff Bull Connor turned his tanks and his dogs on children in the streets of downtown Birmingham. 1963 is the year that Medgar Evers, the Mississippi head of the NAACP, is shot down dead in his driveway, right? 1963 is a high water mark for the civil rights struggle, which is to say that it must have been a pretty high water mark for systemic oppression, because people don't struggle when there's nothing to struggle against. So one would imagine, right, that in 1963, things must have been pretty bad. That's why 250,000 people march on Washington in late August. You ever been to Washington in late August? That is hot, man. People don't do that for shits and giggles. They don't do that because they got nothing better to do. It is really hot. It is really uncomfortable. So if you're going to march on Washington August 28th of any year, I guarantee you, you must have some type of grievance. But yet, even in the midst of all that, even at a time when racism and discrimination were right there in the news every night. Every night, because remember, there were only 3 television channels in the early 60s. Some of us remember these days. I wasn't alive then, but it was this way till about 81. You had 3 stations, they all went off about midnight, played the Star Spangled Banner, and then it was static for 6 hours, right? And it's not like you had today, you got 300 channels. You could theoretically avoid the news now. Like, you can just watch reality TV and play video games and, you know, just play on a phone and never have to actually pay attention to the news. But in '63, the news was the only game in town. People were riveted to it, and yet apparently white folks couldn't tell what it was they were looking at. Because when white Americans were asked in '63, in the midst of all of this civil rights drama, hey, do you think that racial minorities, this was a question asked to them by the Gallup organization, they said, do you think that racial minorities are treated equally in your community in housing, education, and employment? And again, it's 1963, y'all. Like, in retrospect, this is a real easy question with a really easy answer that no one in here is going to miss 52 years later, right? I mean, even the Klan would be like, no, it wasn't equal, and we liked it like that. Right? Even the most overt white supremacists would be like, no, it was not equal, thank God, right? Everyone knows it wasn't now. But in 1963, when white folks were asked that question, a large sample of white Americans, right, from all across the country, different parts of the country, asked that question. 2 out of 3 white folks said, oh yeah, everything's equal. Racial minorities are treated equally. Racism, what? Discrimination, what? We couldn't see it. 1962, Gallup said, in another poll, they asked white Americans, do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education as white children? And again, come on, it's 62, right? In retrospect, we know the answer is of course not. But in 1962, when the question was asked, 87 out of 100 white folks said yes. Almost 9 out of 10 white Americans looking at the same thing that we can now look at in retrospect and see very clearly, totally unable to see it. How is that possible? How is it that basically decent people could be so wrong? Because I do think those white folks were basically decent people. I think most people are good people. I could be wrong. But as a parent of 2 young children, I have a vested interest in believing that maybe the world is a just and a decent place and that maybe most people are good folks. So I tend to believe that when those white folks, 9 out of 10 virtually, couldn't see the reality of unequal education, or 2 out of 3 couldn't see the reality of discrimination more broadly, it wasn't because they were bad people, and it wasn't because they were uncaring, and it wasn't because they were just stupid and unable to see the truth. It has to be something else. What's the only other possible explanation? The only one I can think of is this: white Americans didn't know the truth because we didn't have to. And that too has not changed. Not in 20 years, not in 50 years, not in a century. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if you're white in 1963 and Gallup asks you that question about your basic social reality, about the country in which you live, and you don't know the truth and you get it wrong, as so many did by saying that everything was fine, what was the consequence that you faced for being ignorant? There was none. You didn't have to know the truth. You could be ignorant to people of color's reality because it wasn't going to be on the test, was it? And by that, I mean whatever test you had to take to graduate from high school, to get into college, law school, medical school, business school, to get a professional license in any career of your choosing. You didn't have to know the reality of millions of your fellow countrymen and countrywomen, and you could still be considered competent. Isn't that interesting? That white folks could be totally stone cold oblivious to the reality of millions of their fellow citizens and still be considered competent enough to have jobs and receive education. See, people of color don't have that luxury on the other side, do they? People of color don't get to stay ignorant to the things that white folks think are important, because that will be on the test, right? In fact, that will be the whole test. Whatever's on the test, I promise you, is something that the dominant group decided was important knowledge. And people of color better damn well know it. That's why they have to learn white literature and white theater and white poetry and white art. And yes, I know we don't call it that. That is the point, right? When your stuff is considered the norm, you don't have to racially designate its origin. You don't have to call it white literature. You can just call it literature and theater and poetry and art. For those who were confused, shall we clear it up before February? This is why we don't have White History Month, okay? Because you got May and June and July and August and September and pretty much every other month that hasn't been designated for people of color. That's ours, and we will learn about white folks, and we don't have to call it white history. That's just operative and normative and normalized. That's how privilege functions. It normalizes the dominant group's experience at the expense of everyone else. And here's what's interesting. This obliviousness that white folks are allowed to have around race is something that every one of us has in some category. This isn't just race, right? Men get to be oblivious to the reality of sexism, patriarchy, rape culture, and how those things affect women. We don't have to know the truth. I would argue we should. It's important for us to, but we don't have to, right? Those of us who are middle class, upper middle class, or affluent, we don't have to know the reality that poor and low income and working class folks experience. We can be oblivious. Those of us who are straight or cisgendered, we don't have to know the reality of straight supremacy, heterosexism, homophobia, or transphobia. We don't have to know any of that. And we can still be deemed competent. Those of us who are able-bodied can be ignorant about the reality of those with various disabilities. Those of us who have the ability to hear don't have to think about autism and how it affects those who are not hearing, those in the deaf community. You see, we have an interpreter here right now, and those of us who don't face autism, those of us who have never even heard that word, because we don't have to hear that word. We don't have to know about discrimination and marginalization of the deaf community. That's a privilege. It doesn't make you a bad person that you don't think about it, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that if you're a hearing person that you're a bad person for not thinking about autism, but it does mean you got a leg up, doesn't it? It means that you have an advantage. It means that you have the privilege, the luxury of being stone cold ignorant to someone else's reality. And the danger when you're oblivious is that when you don't have to know something, the odds are you won't understand it. And then when you're trying to build community with the people who do have to understand it, just as a function of daily life, it's really hard to do, isn't it? Right? It's really hard to do. And then unfortunately, those of us who get to be oblivious still act like we know more than the people who don't have that luxury. So like, here's the deal. Like, I'm oblivious to calculus. You know why? Because I didn't take it. You know why? Because they didn't make me. And if they weren't going to make me take calculus, I sure as hell was not going to take calculus. No offense to math folks in the room who love or teach calculus. I'm glad y'all are doing it. Somebody has to. It just wasn't going to be me. That's all I'm saying. So I didn't take it. As a result, I wouldn't know how to do it. So if I were to stand up here and start doing it like on a chalkboard or something, or on a screen, on an overhead projector, y'all would all be like, wait a minute. Didn't he just tell us he doesn't know how to do? He didn't even take the class. Exactly. But see, that's how identity works in America, isn't it? Those of us who are white like to tell people of color that we know their reality better than they know their reality, and we didn't take the class. See? Men like to tell women that we know their reality better than they know their reality, and we didn't take the class. Those of us who are straight or cisgendered like to tell folks who are LGBT that we know their truth better than they know their truth, and we did not take the class. Do you see what this is? This is the blue pill from the Matrix, is what this is. You ever seen that film, right? You see there's that scene early on, right, where Lawrence Fishburne's character Morpheus offers Keanu Reeves' character Neo 2 pills, one is blue, one is red, and he says something along the lines of the following. I'm paraphrasing, but this is pretty close. He says, you can take the blue pill if you prefer, and the story ends. And you can remain oblivious just like everybody else. You don't have to know the truth. No one wants to know it. They'd rather die than know it. So if you want to be like them, you don't want to see what's really going on, take the blue pill and we're done. Or he says you can take the red pill and I can take you down the rabbit hole and I can show you how deep it goes and you can have enlightenment and you can see what's really happening in this society. And so Neo takes the red pill and all of a sudden, right, he starts to see all the stuff that was always there, always happening, but which he didn't have to notice. That is almost a perfect metaphor for privilege and identity in this country. Because when you're a member of a dominant group, you get to take the blue pill as a matter of daily routine and not even know you're taking it, right? You get to walk around with a blue pill IV drip. And you don't even know it's attached to your arm, right? So white folks are like, dooby-dooby-dooby-doo. Black and brown folks are like, you don't see this racism? And we're like, no, I think I got this IV. I don't know what this is. I don't see anything. Women are like, don't you see this? And dudes are like, no, blue pill. And I know that men and blue pill means like some different shit. Since the Matrix, that's taken on like a whole different meaning. I realize that. You can thank Pfizer for the fact that you get that joke. That's the power of pharmaceutical marketing, so, right? So I realize that, but I'm not talking about that blue pill. I'm talking about the Matrix, right? So you get the, and here's the thing, every one of us in here takes the blue pill on something, guarantee it, right? So it's not just white people, it's not just white men, it's not just straight white men. Everybody in this room has got at least one area, I guarantee, where you are the dominant group. And in that area, you don't have to know the truth about somebody else. So what I'm really asking us to do is start to really think deeply about what it means to have that luxury and how dangerous that is. Because see, when you don't have to think about the truth and you get to ignore it, it's very hard to build community. So you can't address some of these issues that we're seeing right now, like the problem in law enforcement, right? If you don't have to know the reality, either now or historically, how do you have a conversation across racial lines with people who have no choice but to know that reality? See, right now, in the midst of this current crisis of law enforcement, where the data tells us that in the most recent period, young black men are 21 times more likely than young white men to be killed by police. And it's not because they commit crime 21 times more often. Over a 10-year period, 9 times more likely to be killed by police, 2 to 3 times more likely to be killed unarmed relative to their white counterparts. So it's not about dangerousness, it's not about posing a threat to officers, it's about something else. But it's very hard to have that conversation across racial lines because people of color, even if they don't know those exact numbers, they know the context and the history behind those numbers. And a lot of times those of us who are white, we don't. So we don't understand how black and brown folks see cops so differently than we do. We don't understand that. We get real uptight about it because we've experienced, by and large, law enforcement one way, and people of color really have experienced it a different way. That's not hyperbole. That's not exaggeration. That's history, but we might not know that history, right? So if we don't know that history, and then black folks stand up and insist that Black Lives Matter, then folks are like, no, all lives matter. No. Yes, precious, we know. The point is, all the rest of our lives already were presumed to matter, particularly if we were white, so we don't have to proclaim it. You see, you have to proclaim that which is usually ignored. White folks' lives have been valued in this country since the jump, you see. Black and brown folk, not so much. That's why we have to say it. But then law enforcement folks say, Black Lives Matter, that's a police assassination group. They're going to go out and kill police. Police are increasingly being subjected to violence. Actually, again, facts matter. Your hyperbole, your opinion means nothing in the face of actual evidence. The truth is that we are right now on a particular course to have a year which will show the lowest number of law enforcement deaths on duty in the last 25 years. That is the truth. So no, Black Lives Matter is not out killing cops. No one affiliated with that movement has killed any law enforcement officer. And even of the 36 or so, 35, whatever the number is, law enforcement officials who have died on duty, 5, 6, 7 of them weren't killed at all. They died in traffic accidents. One of them had a heart attack at the gym, right? One of them was detailing his motorcycle and dropped dead of a heart attack. I mean, it's a horrible tragedy. But unless Black Lives Matter is putting extra cholesterol in the donuts, I don't think you can actually blame them for that. Just saying, like you can't blame that on an activist organization. So let's stop lying, because the number of young black and brown folks killed by law enforcement, unarmed, is at a 40-year high. The number of law enforcement killed by black and brown folks is at a quarter-century low. Those facts do matter, and they explain the differential way in which some people see law enforcement and others do. But white folks don't have to know that history. We don't have to think about that. We act as if police are the nice, friendly people that come get your cat out of the tree and drive you around in a ride-along to show you how exciting it is to be an officer. That's not the black and brown experience. Historically, law enforcement were the folks who caught runaway slaves. They were the folks who enforced the black codes after enslavement. They were the folks who participated directly in the lynching of thousands of black and brown bodies. They were the folks who participated actively in pogroms, race riots against black communities in places like East St. Louis, Illinois, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and elsewhere all around this country from coast to coast. They were the ones who pulled civil rights demonstrators off of stools. They were all in uniform. They all had badges. They all had guns. They all had the power of the state. They were law enforcement. So to ask black and brown folks to act like that history doesn't matter or they should ignore it, everyone knows that not all officers are implicated in that. But let me ask you, how many officers during all of those things I just mentioned actually stood up against the people who were doing it? You can count them on a couple of hands. So if you have a culture within law enforcement that doesn't speak up against the brutality of some, then that is to suggest it isn't a handful of bad apples. It is a rotten orchard from which some decent officers emerge. But until they are willing to turn in their brothers and sisters in blue, until they are willing to rat them out and end their careers as professional law enforcement officers, then no one should mouth the words, "not all police." As long as law enforcement is enforcing the war on drugs, which I beg to remind you is not really a war on drugs, then I really don't want to hear lectures about how we have to go easy on cops. I worked 15 months in public housing in New Orleans as a community organizer, and I saw fewer drugs in those 15 months. Poorest communities in the city of New Orleans, some of the poorest in the United States, I saw fewer drugs being used or dealt in those communities in 15 months than I saw on a typical Saturday in my dorm room at Tulane University. But I also knew that I wasn't going to get arrested and I wasn't going to jail, right? So the war on drugs has nothing to do, but as long as law enforcement keeps enforcing it, right? As long as law enforcement keeps playing that game, then they're implicated in it. That's why black and brown folks have a hard time trusting law enforcement. See, we have to rebuild trust on the basis of facts and history and an understanding, but when people get to be oblivious, and even those good cops out there, and there are lots of them, but those good cops out there that don't know that history, right? They find themselves unable to change it. They find themselves unable to push back against it because they don't even realize it, right? So caught up in that idea that they're good people and they're just a handful of bad ones. But if you don't understand this long history of oppression, the way that law enforcement has been the cutting edge of that, and you're a good, conscientious officer, you're going to end up coming up against a culture that you can't defeat because you don't even know what you're up against. That's why a lot of times good officers end up leaving right? Because they can't make the kind of changes that they want to make. There's this one young guy, looks like he's about 12. I guess he's probably in his late 20s, early 30s, in Baltimore. I can't remember his name, but he's all over YouTube. He's been doing a lot of media lately. This young white dude who was run out of the Baltimore Police Department for speaking up against the brutality and the corruption of his colleagues. And he got run out. His career has been ended for trying to do the right thing. Because when you cross that thin blue line and you call out folks for doing illegal activity and framing people and brutalizing people in the name of crime control, then they end your career. See, that's a good cop right there. But he's not now because he's not a cop. He's a good man, I suppose, but he can't be a cop anymore because he's not allowed to be in a culture that says you have to keep your mouth shut and whatever a cop says goes. See, that's what we do in police states. That's the kind of stuff they do in other countries that we condemn them for. And then we turn around and we do it and we act like nothing is wrong with it. But if you don't know the history, it's very difficult to get your head around that, let alone to change it. Same thing with immigration. If we don't understand, see, we have all this debate about immigration, and the biggest thing getting in the way of an honest conversation or a productive immigration policy is the mythology of this country that so many folks have bought into, especially white folks, but not only white folks, and not all white folks, but again, mostly so, white folks who will say things like, well, I don't mind immigrants coming, I just want them to come the right way like my family did. Really? Okay. Let's talk about that then. The right way, like what does that mean? People say, well, my great-great-grandfather came legally. Why can't they come legally?
Yes, welcome back to the channel. What a great lecture by Tim Wise. I think he's really done a great justice to the topic. He's gone deeper and looked at the intricacies that exist within American system, especially when it comes to relationship between blacks and whites and how opportunities present themselves for both demographic groups. So Tim Wise, a renowned anti-racist educator and author, has been vocal in challenging the myth of meritocracy in America, the idea that success is solely based on individual effort and talent. One of the key ways he debunked this myth is by exposing the structural inequalities that favor white Americans over people of color, particularly black Americans. He argues that centuries of institutional racism, such as slavery, segregation, and discriminatory policies in housing and education, have created a deeply uneven playing field. This historical context, according to Wise, makes it illogical and unjust to claim that everyone has an equal shot at success in America. Another strategy Wise uses to dismantle the meritocracy myth is his analysis of white privilege. He illustrates how white individuals often benefit from an advantages in areas like employment, criminal justice, and access to quality education. These benefits are not the result of merit, but rather systemic preferences that maintain racial hierarchies. By highlighting these disadvantages, Wise shows that the success of many white Americans cannot be entirely attributed to hard work alone, thereby discrediting the narrative that meritocracy is alive and well. Tim Wise also frequently uses statistics and empirical data to support his claims. He points to disparities in wealth, incarceration rates, job opportunities, and healthcare access as evidence of ongoing racial discrimination. These disparities persist even when education and experience are equal, undermining the argument that individual effort determines outcomes. By grounding his arguments in data, Wise adds credibility to his assertion that America's social and economic systems are skewed against black people and other minorities. Additionally, Wise draws attention to cultural narratives that uphold the myth of meritocracy, such as the American dream and the portrayal of US as a land of opportunity. He argues that these narratives are often weaponized to blame black communities for their socioeconomic status while ignoring systemic barriers. Wise deconstructs these cultural myths through public speaking, writings, and media appearances, emphasizing that they serve to maintain white dominance and suppress calls for racial justice. Wise consistently champions respect and justice for black Americans because he recognizes the long history of exploitation, exclusion, and violence they have endured. He believes that true equality can only be achieved when society acknowledges and addresses these injustices rather than pretending they do not exist. His advocacy is rooted in the conviction that respect is not just a moral imperative, but also a necessary step towards healing and unity. By calling out racism and advocating for systemic change, Wise urges society to move beyond empty meritocratic ideals and towards a more equitable reality. I think that explains the entire video that Tim Wise has just presented. He is someone who has always spoken truth to power and really talked about the real truth that affects Black people and how their opportunities and circumstances are affected by white power structures within America. If you're watching us for the first time, please consider subscribing to the channel, like the video, and share. You can also join our membership to get access to exclusive content we have for you in this channel. Thank you, and let's meet in the next one.